Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Tech Talk with me, Kazeem. Today on the show, we're going to be talking Azure Backup, and I have the Azure Backup guru with me, Alan Kinan. Hi, Alan, and welcome to the Tech Talk show.
Hi, Kazeem. Nice to be on the show. Thanks for having me today.
So let's kick things off with an introduction, Alan. Who is Alan, and what do you do for a living?
Yeah, so my name is Alan Kinan. I am an Azure MVP based in Dublin, Ireland. So I work as a cloud solution architect for a CSP and direct provider. So what that means is I get to work with a lot of different Microsoft partners based here in Ireland and also some in the UK. And I work with them to help them architect solutions, do up pricing, and then do their project implementations as well. And I also get to do a lot of Azure training as part of my role as well. So I need to keep up to date all the time with all the latest ongoings in Azure. So it's a really enjoyable role in that respect because I get to learn lots of new stuff as it comes out all the time. So it's pretty cool, pretty good fun.
So I want us to kick things off with the reason why we need backup, right? Especially in the Azure cloud, because some of the people new to Azure might be wondering that if they're paying to have their workloads on Azure, to have their data on Azure, would there still be a need for them to back it up? So let's start with that. Do we
Yeah.
still need to worry about backing up the data that we have on Azure?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a common question for certainly people who are new to working in the cloud. Yes, I mean, obviously your data is going to be stored there, and Microsoft are good in that they keep redundant copies of your data. So you're always going to have 3 copies of your live data in a Microsoft data center. And that's, as I said, kept for redundancy purposes. So if there is an outage or a disaster, that there should be an available copy of your data that you can get access to. But if we think about what backup is really a historical copy of your data over a period of time. So while you have your live data today, what happens if you need to go back to yesterday's data or last week or last month's data? So Microsoft are not going to be able to keep copies of your data for free of charge, because they don't know how long to keep it for or how many copies you need. So it's really up to you to opt in to backup and say, well, yes, I need to keep copies of my data. And some organizations have compliance requirements where they need to keep data for a very long time, maybe like 7 years or something. So it's up to you to decide on your own backup policy and how regularly you need to keep backups. The good thing is Azure is quite efficient at doing backup because it uses incremental backup. So it's really only storing the changes that occur since the previous backup. And because you're leveraging the super cheap storage that's available in Azure.
So let's touch on cost effectiveness next. The cost effectiveness of using Azure, maybe its pricing too. I know that's another major concern that people may have. When it comes to cost, how cost effective is using Azure Backup over other on-prem backup solutions? Because people may also argue that they only have to pay for some of this solution one time and only have perhaps storage to contend with.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I suppose most customers would be familiar with doing their own backups on premises, and they would have invested in infrastructure for doing that. I suppose the main difference is with most things with cloud, it's a pay-as-you-go service. So you're paying as you go for what you consume. There's no upfront investment. Obviously, you don't need to buy any of that hardware for doing your backup. So if you're doing an on-premises backup, you might have backup servers. They're going to have licensing requirements for the backup software, and you're going to need the storage. You're going to need somewhere to store all that backup data. And that could be quite expensive depending on how long you need to keep your backups for and how much data you're backing up. So you've got all those upfront costs. The other main difference is when you're backing up on premises, unless you're adhering to the 3-2-1 rule, which means you should keep a copy of your data off-site at all times, you could be in trouble if there's a local disaster, like if there's a fire or a flood in the building and your server data is destroyed, but also your backup copy is also destroyed. So it's important to always keep at least one off-site copy of your data. So that's where Azure Backup can come in. And even if you're just running workloads on premises, so you've got no servers or storage in the cloud yet, if your servers are still running on premises, you can still choose to use Azure Backup to back up those on premises servers into Azure Cloud Storage. And it's a really cost-effective solution for doing those offsite backups. So yeah, I think it's a good starting point to get into Azure. I think we would see a lot of Microsoft partners. Their very first Azure service is Azure Backup because it's one of the easier ones to deploy. It's one of the cheaper ones to run. It lends itself as well to having multiple customers on it, so it's very easy to if you've got a lot of customers to look after, you can roll out Azure Backup for those customers and manage that at scale then using Azure Backup. So I think it's a good service for customers to start out with, and it's something you can use very much as a hybrid model. So you're keeping those systems on premises and you have a mix of other systems running in the cloud. It can cover both of those for you.
So how about storage redundancy, right? Let's also touch on that just slightly. I know the storage redundancy that we choose have a way of impacting our backup cost. So I
Yeah.
want to ask you, Alan, first, what is storage redundancy for those wondering what that means? And how can the redundancy choice affect our backup cost?
Yeah, so with the cloud, you've a lot of different redundancy options, which I'll go through in a moment. But first and foremost, what it means is it means having multiple copies of your data in this case. So when we talk about storage with Azure, it's using blob storage. That's what Azure Backup uses. So it stores your data in something called blob storage, which is basically binary object storage. And you have a different option of which redundancy level you want. So I mentioned already, at a minimum, you will have always 3 copies of your data. So really the starting point for redundancy is something called locally redundant storage. And with this option, and this would be the cheapest option, Microsoft keep 3 copies of your data, but they just keep it all within one data center, within one Azure region. So you've got 3 copies of your data there, all kept within one data center, so inside one building. The other common option would be something called geo-redundant storage. And this is a far more resilient option. So they still keep those 3 copies in one Azure data center, but they also keep an additional 3 copies of your data. And that's replicated to another Azure region. So it's your paired region. So my closest region to me is the North Europe region. That's actually based here in Dublin. And we're paired with the West Europe region, which is based in the Netherlands. So if you choose geo-redundant storage, I'll have 3 copies of my data kept here in Ireland, and I have another 3 copies replicated over to the Netherlands. So if there was an entire regional outage in the North Europe region where I am, it means I can still access my data in the West Europe region. And actually only as of, I think, a week or maybe 2 weeks ago, there's actually now another option for Azure Backup, and that's zone redundant storage. So this has been available for blob storage for a while now, but it's only just gone generally available for Azure Backup. So with zone redundant storage, it means for those regions that have multiple availability zones, which is effectively multiple data centers in the same region, it means you can keep those 3 copies spread out in those different availability zones. So again, my region, North Europe, we have availability zones. If I choose to have zone redundant storage, those 3 copies will be kept in separate data centers. And those data centers all have their own independent power supplies, independent internet uplinks, cooling systems. So the chances of all of those data centers going down at the same time is quite slim. So you've got those options to choose from. As you can imagine, it gets a bit more expensive the more you go up. So local redundant storage would be the cheapest option. Then for a little bit more, it's zone redundant storage. And then if you want to pay more again, you'll get geo-redundant storage. But the more you pay, I suppose, the more resilient your redundancy option is. So it's really up to you to choose what you want to go for.
Let me quickly check with you on this. At what point do one need to go high up there, like working with the geo-redundant storage as opposed to just working with the regular locally redundant storage?
Yeah, it usually comes down to the organization's compliance requirements. Sometimes they have to have service SLAs where they have to have multiple copies of the data kept in separate data centers. So again, that's where zone redundant storage is a really great option there, because it's in separate data centers. And sometimes organizations, they don't want their data leaving even the country that they're in. If that's the case, you don't want to use geo-redundant storage because it will be replicated to another country. Now, with geo-replication, it never leaves the same geographic region. So for me, I'm in the European Union region, so my data will never leave the EU. If you're in the UK, for example, there's 2 UK regions there, and the data never leaves the UK. Same with the US, your data never leaves that geography. So you are protected from that point of view. But it really depends on, I think, the size of the organization and their compliance requirements as to what they go with. But also how business critical access to their data or backups in this case is. If it's really super important that they cannot possibly risk not having access to their backups, that's when you need to go with the higher redundancy options. But for smaller organizations, the local redundant storage option is a pretty good choice also, because you've still got those 3 copies of your data. And that's usually sufficient for smaller businesses. So yeah, that's what it comes down to, in my opinion.
So, in just a few minutes, is there a chance you could show us what the interface of the Azure Backup looks like, and
Yeah,
perhaps just touch on a few of the things that we can do with it?
yeah,
Just
absolutely.
briefly.
Yeah, sure. What I will do is I'll just share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, so what we're looking here is actually something called the Azure Backup Center. So Azure Backup has been around for quite a while at this stage. And there's a few different options with it. There's a few different ways you can get into the settings behind it. But Microsoft released this blade, the Azure Backup Center, some time ago, and it's a really great central interface for managing your Azure Backup at this point. So I'm just going to go through this because this gives you a great overview of how to manage all of your backups. And the first thing I want to point out here is these are just some test accounts that I use, but I'm using a feature called Azure Lighthouse here, which means if you've got multiple customers to manage, you can actually manage multiple tenant directories here and select all the subscriptions within those tenants. So if I'm like a managed service provider, I might be able to manage multiple customers all from one place here. So I've onboarded these fake customer accounts here to my management tenant. And what that means is I can now filter on those subscriptions here. So I can see all of those customer subscriptions in one place, which means I can look at the backup job history of all of my customers in one place. So in the past, we would have had to go into each customer separately and manage those backups on those tenants individually, but now I can manage them in one place. So just on this overview screen, I can see quite simply, okay, all of my backups have completed successfully. None of them have failed. That's great. If I had any backup alerts, they would appear here. I also can filter on different types of backups. You can back up Azure Virtual Machine, SQL, Azure Files, SAP HANA, disks, and blob storage nowadays, and PostgreSQL as well. If I want to look at the individual backup instances, I can go in here and I can see those VMs, see the subscription they're on, resource groups, Azure regions, and again, the status of them, and various filtering options with those. This is what I want to focus on a little bit, is the backup policies. So this is where you can decide, well, what is my policy? How long do I need to keep my backups for? How regularly do I need to keep those? And you can have multiple policies. Even for one customer, you can have different policies for different workload types. So I can manage all of these policies across my customers here. I can go in and have a look at the settings. As you can see, you can specify how long you want to keep the backups for. So I'm just keeping 30-day backups here, but I could easily have weekly backup, monthly, yearly backup points. And again, as I said, for some customers, you may need to keep those backup points for an extended period of time. Just to show you briefly with enhanced, this is a newer option for Azure Backup now. There's this enhanced policy option. So in the past, we could only do one Azure VM backup per day. Now we have this option to do it every 4 hours at the moment. So this is a great addition to Azure Backup. So as I was saying, you would have had to, or you would have only been able to back up your virtual machines once per day. But if you've got a workload that's changing very regularly, you might say, well, I want to do 2 or 3 backups a day. So now you've got an option to do one every 4 hours. You will have a slight cost increase just because you've got more incremental backups. Obviously, there's data changes being taken place throughout the day, and you're doing those incremental backups every 4 hours. So it would be slightly more expensive to do this, but now it's a great option, where in the past that option was not there. These are the backup and recovery services vaults. So originally we only had an option for something called recovery service vaults. This was an Azure resource used for Azure Backup and also for Azure Site Recovery, which is a replication service. And now we've also got Azure Backup Vaults, and this is used for taking snapshots instead. So just for taking disk snapshots or Azure file snapshots, they go into a backup vault rather than recovery service vaults. We've got these two different backup vault types, but you can manage them all from here and again across multiple customers. Here's just an overview of those backup jobs again, the times they run at, the duration, all those details. If I had any alerts, they would appear here, and you can go back to your history. That's the last 24 hours, last 30 days. Still good. I don't think I have any alerts for the last 30 days, but it means you can review those alert history across your customers in one easy screen. You've got backup reports. This is something you have to turn on. This just uses Log Analytics workspaces to pull in further details. So it's just ingesting data from your backup into a Log Analytics workspace, and then you can pull these together and build out a nice report on those. It'll just take a minute or so to load, but you'll be able to see a full history then and detailed analysis of your backups over an extended period of time. That'll load in there in a minute or so, but it's a nice tool just to enable this for your backup vaults. And another thing that's important with this is you can actually automatically set up this feature with an Azure policy. So here's my reports here. It shows you the job success and the cloud storage consumed. And again, you can go into the different blades to view further information on your backup history. So just in terms of the policies I mentioned, I'll skip down to this one for now. So there's a number of backup related policies built into Azure. So these are there by default. So you can enforce Azure Backup from machines. So it's something that's often forgotten about. You deploy a virtual machine, but you forget to turn on the backup. And then if something happens to that, you might lose your data. So you can enforce backup to be turned on by using Azure policy, or at least be alerted to do so. You can enforce those configuration settings for Log Analytics that I mentioned. And there's a few other policies in here as well that you can set and configure. And then, of course, you can check the compliance of those policies to make sure your resources are compliant. So thankfully, all of mine are. So I've got these diagnostic settings that I mentioned turned on, and they are all compliant. So all of my recovery services vaults are using those settings, which is great. And then this last one, which is important as well, protectable data sources. So this is showing me that I've got 17 Azure virtual machines that are not currently configured for backup. Now, most of these are just test VMs, so I'm happy with those. I don't need those backed up, but it's just good to be able to see at a glance the number of Azure VMs in this case. Although you can filter, I think, on other options as well. But I can see I've got 17 unprotected VMs, so I can quickly see, right, I need to back those up. And you can actually do it very quickly just by selecting on backup. That will bring me in. I can choose an existing vault, and I can choose a policy from my drop down, and I can very quickly enable that. So that was what, 2 clicks? 2 clicks to enable backup on that machine, and that will go and add that to my backup setup now as well. So that's a very quick overview then, Kazeem, just of Azure Backup and how to manage it. But I definitely recommend using Backup Center. If you've been using Azure Backup for a while, just type Backup Center in the search here and have a look. It's a really powerful tool, especially if you're trying to manage your backups across multiple customers.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alan, for that walkthrough. So I want us to wrap things up now, Alan, with best practices. So because of time, what would your top 3 best practices be for using Azure Backup, especially those that has to do with cost savings?
Okay. I would say policies anyway. I'd say what I just mentioned there, Azure policy would be good to make sure you're putting in guardrails for your backup. So making sure that at a minimum you're being alerted about resources that are not being backed up, because like I said, it's very easy to be deploying resources and just forget to back them up because it won't be turned on by default. So you can enforce that with Azure policy, but at a minimum, at least get alerted that you have unprotected resources. I would say review your backup policies at least once a year, because if you're doing a backup for 30 days or 6 months or 12 months, over time you may decide, well, actually I need more backup retention points, or maybe I'd need less. So you might find, oh my God, I've got way too many backup restore points here. I don't need that many. It's costing me a lot of money. So if you review your policies periodically, you may decide, oh, actually, I don't need so many retention points. I can reduce those and change your policies. And it will tidy those up for you automatically just by changing your policies. And then third one, actually, again, quite a new feature is there's now an archive tier for Azure Backup. So as we might know already, Azure Blob Storage has had an archive tier for a while. That's now available for Azure Backup. So what that means is for those long-term retention backups you have, so again, when you're keeping backups from maybe multiple years, rather than just doing an incremental backup every single day or every single week for years and years and years, what you can do is you can offload some of those older backups, maybe everything that's older than a year, offload it to archive storage. So it's much cheaper to store those backups in the archive tier. Just the one thing to be careful with there is if you're using archive tier, it actually has to do a full backup. It's not an incremental, it takes a full backup. So it does store a bit more data, but it is storing it in much cheaper storage. And there's great tools built into the Azure portal for recommendations on when it makes sense to start using the archive tier. So that's a great option as well, I think. Yeah.
Is there any last word before we wrap up now, Alan?
Just on Azure Backup, just again keep an eye on the updates, Azure updates. There's been quite a few recent additions to the service, some of which I've mentioned today. One that's in public preview at the moment is immutable storage for Azure Backup. That's something we've had a lot of customers ask about. They want to have immutable storage so that when you take your backups, you cannot delete them until that backup expires. So that's now in a public preview. So again, like with everything in Azure, keep your eye on the news and see what new updates are there. But it's a service that's really evolved a lot over the last number of years, and there's a lot of great features there now. So yeah, that's my advice. Always keep an eye on the news for Azure. It's always changing.
So you've heard it from Alan on today's episode of the Tech Talk. So here's where we're going to call it a wrap today. Thank you very much once again, Alan. So please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if you like this particular video, do give it a thumbs up and share it among your peers as well. So on that note, it's a bye-bye from myself and Alan, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.